Hi, y'all. I'm Atticus, a bookseller at Literati Bookstore and the host for tonight's event. This evening, we are pleased to welcome Ivan Maisel to our At Home with Literati series in support of I Keep Trying to Catch His Eye. For our attendees, the chat is closed, but I will be dropping links to purchase I Keep Trying to Catch His Eye from Literati throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature on your toolbar to submit questions at any time. I'll ask a selection of them at the conclusion of the event. A reminder that you can shop for more books in-store or at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup and shipping to your home anywhere in the United States. And now, allow me to introduce tonight's author, Ivan Maisel. Ivan Maisel is the Vice President and Senior Writer at On3.com. He has covered college football for nearly 4 decades, from 2002 to 2021. Sorry, Maisel, I mispronounced that. And he's been a senior writer for ESPN, as well as appearing on television, radio, and podcasts. He has also served as editor-at-large for ESPN College Football 150. And prior to joining ESPN.com, Maisel covered national college football for Sports Illustrated, Newsday, and the Dallas Morning News. He has been honored 8 times for Best Story by the Football Writers Association of America, and twice by the Associated Press Sports Editors, which in 2019 named him one of the 10 best sports columnists. Maisel earned a bachelor's degree in American Studies from Stanford University. Without further ado, I'll throw it over to Ivan.
Thank you, Atticus, and thank you, Ann Arbor. Thank you, Literati. It's one of my favorite bookstores. I'm delighted to be here. I am going to start off by reading a passage from I Keep Trying to Catch His Eye, and it is early in the book and it's about how really the central tenet of the book, which is that grief is love. So here we go. On a very cold night of a very cold winter, our 21-year-old son, Max, walked off an ice-slicked pier onto the surface of Lake Ontario. We, my wife, Meg, his sisters, Sarah and Elizabeth, and I, presume that he walked until the ice gave way beneath him. We don't know. We will never know. An eyewitness saw him get out of his car, an 11-year-old SUV that once had belonged to his beloved grandfather, and walk onto the pier. Law enforcement eventually spotted some of Max's belongings near the end of the pier, on the solid surface of the lake. And 8 weeks later, the 4th week of spring, according to the calendar, Lake Ontario surrendered his body. Would not be much of a whodunit. Those are the facts that we know. He left no note. Max wasn't much on communicating. I Keep Trying to Catch His Eye is about the death of my son, Max, the grief that engulfed our family, and how I learned to coexist with that grief. I will not be so presumptuous as to include here how my wife and our 2 daughters have dealt with their grief. That consideration is pretty rich, given that what I do for a living as a journalist is become presumptuous enough to write a story and explain someone I hardly know. But, and this will not be the first time you hear me read this, little is more personal than grief. All grief is personal, and all grief is as individual as the person doing the grieving. Love is personal too, and there's certainly no shortage of writing about love. As I wrote, I began to understand that grief, if you get past the awkward social construct that American culture has with death, is the purest form of an expression of love for someone who is no longer here to express it back. We mourn the deepest for those whom we love the most. We view grief warily, as an alien force that invades us when we are at our most vulnerable. I'm not going to pretend that I didn't suffer greatly when Max died. I'm not going to tell you that I didn't ache, that I no longer feel a void. But as I learned how to go on with my life, as I wrestled with and tried to make sense of my pain, I began to see the direct correlation between the love I had for the son I lost and the depth of my pain, my grief. Grief is love. Understanding that grief is love tempers the inevitable pain. Seeing grief as love helped me handle its all-consuming nature. Seeing grief as love made it seem less alien, less painful. We no longer had Max. We had all this love for Max and no Max. We had his absence. That love metamorphosed into grief. There is so much about the death of a child that is more difficult to process. The generational incongruity, the unceasing what ifs and where would he be's, magical thinking that always will bedevil the four of us whom Max left behind. I can't tell you how long it took me to see grief as love. I am hoping that, by describing it to you that way, it may save you some steps. Maybe it's just a mind trick, but seeing grief as love worked for me. It made grief more palatable, and death, the one experience we all share, less fearsome. I am not hell-bent on turning our pain into a positive outcome. I am not driven to say that Max did not die in vain. That is a little too cloying for my palate. But if the story of my relationship with Max resonates with those who read it, then it would be nice to think that a sliver of this awfulness helped someone. So that's from chapter 1. And as I said, that took me a while to figure out that grief is love. And I think it started out really by learning how to become comfortable with grief. I had to learn how to carry it. We have a saying in our house that belongs to my wife, Meg, that we don't do prepositions. You don't get over grief. You don't get through grief. And that permanence of it, getting used to the permanence of it helped, understanding that it was something that I had to carry with me as I moved on with my life. I think one thing that I read that helped me, and I didn't read a lot about grief. I read some. Again, my wife read a lot of books about grief. The one thing I read that really resonated with me was a poem written by Edward Hirsch, who was a prominent American poet who wrote a poem about his son Gabriel, who died in his 20s. And the name of the poem is Gabriel. And there's a passage in there where Hirsch described grief as a bag of cement that you carry up a hill that never ends. And I really like that because it suggested to me that it's just a weight that I had to get used to, that there is a permanence about it. And once I felt that I just had to get used to this pain and to this feeling, then I began to think, well, what is this feeling exactly? And that's when it dawned on me that I was in this much pain because of the love I have for Max. And seeing the commensurate nature of those two. And that just made it a lot easier for me to carry. And, you have to make a decision early on when you lose someone that how are you going to handle it? Because if you stay in that fetal position that feels so comfortable early after somebody dies, then you are going to miss other things that happen in your life. I figured out pretty early on that just because this really, really, really bad thing happened to me, that there was no correlation between other good things that might still happen. That there was joy out there. And if I was not open to it, I would lose again. And that's a really hard lesson to learn, but it came up early. As I read, it took us 8 weeks to recover Max's body. And the water warmed up in mid-April, as water does. And some poor fisherman happened upon Max's body. God bless that man. 2 weeks after we recovered the body, our nephew got married. And so we had a decision to make. What were we going to not go to the wedding? We sure didn't feel like going to the wedding. But if we didn't go to the wedding, then we lose again. And we punish the rest of my family that would be there for this joyous occasion by not going. And boycotts is too strong a word, obviously, but it's just the feeling that, our absence would be noted. So, and there was some fake it until you make it in there, but we went to the wedding, and I think it was a good lesson to sort of get us used to the notion that life was going to continue. And you just become accustomed to that idea, and time's a wonderful healer. You catch yourself having a good few minutes, and then you catch yourself having a good hour, and then you catch yourself having a good day. And somebody said to me early on, a neighbor who had lost her husband to a heart attack, and she may have gotten it from a greeting card, I don't know, but again, it resonated, and it was along the same sort of thought spectrum I was having, that grief is like standing at the shore, and sometimes the grief washes over your ankles, and sometimes it washes over your head. But in both cases, it goes back out. And understanding that the pain was temporal, that it was not going to be, that I was not going to hurt all the time, that really helped too. So understanding grief and trying to explain it became sort of a mission for me in writing this book, and especially because I was so bad at it. I was so bad at it to begin with before this happened. I'm almost 62 years old, and I have spent most of my life avoiding pain wherever I can. And grief was a pain I chose to avoid. My father died 14 years ago. I handled it terribly. I have deep regrets about that. I didn't try to comfort him. I didn't try to comfort myself. I just pretended that there was a chance he was going to get better. I didn't prepare my children for losing their grandfather. And that, having that experience as my one major experience with grief made me understand that I needed to handle this better. I didn't know how to comfort people who were grieving. And I watched people who approached me and did the same sort of thing that I used to do to people who were grieving. If they got the courage to say anything, they would make a perfunctory statement, and then they would check that box in their mental notebook and never bring it up again. The great secret about when you lose someone, and especially when you lose a child, is that we want to talk about them. Talking about them keeps them present. And especially with a child, you have a finite number of interactions. You have a bowl of memories that is only going to be added to if somebody else comes and puts something in the bowl, because our interactions with Max, sadly enough, are done. We had the book publication date was 3 weeks ago, and we had an event in my hometown in Connecticut, and Max's fourth grade teacher came to the event and told me a wonderful story about Max in the colonial play. We live in New England, fourth grade, there's a colonial play. And Max, who was a shy, withdrawn child, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him in a minute, got up and he was Patrick Henry, and he pounded the table and he forcefully said, "Give me liberty or give me death," to the point that all the other children were looking at him like, wow, that's Max. I had never heard that story, and now that's a memory that somebody gifted me. So, people are reluctant to talk about him in front of us, and especially early on when the death was recent and the pain was so raw. And what I would do, they would say something like, "Well, I wasn't sure what to say," or "I didn't know how to bring him up." And I would smile so they didn't think I was a complete jerk, and say, "Well, good, because if you hadn't have brought him up, I wouldn't have been thinking about him." And that, I hope, got my point across. We want to talk about the people we lose. It keeps them present. So let me tell you a little bit about Max. He's a middle child. He had an older sister and a younger sister. Very shy, very withdrawn. Max was somewhere on the spectrum. He was never diagnosed with anything specific. We were repeatedly told he was not autistic. We were repeatedly told he did not have Asperger's. But it was clear that his wiring was different. And, I think he did not do well with social cues. It was very difficult for him to communicate with his peers. And because of that, he put up a wall. Now, behind that wall, he was just a big doughy lump of sweetness, and really cared about people. As a teenager, for instance, we took Max and his sisters, our daughters, to see the Book of Mormon. We live an hour from Manhattan, and we tried to take the kids to 1 or 2 plays a year, because it's just figuring, the best people in the world are plying their trade an hour away. Let's go see them. The only person that was not doubled over in laughter at the Book of Mormon in that theater on Broadway was my son Max. And he thought they were making fun of the LDS. And he didn't care that everybody else was laughing. He just thought that he was not going to laugh at someone else's expense. That was Max. Now, I'll tell you something else about Max. My son, me, sports crazed for as long as I can remember, make my living writing about college football, sports writer for 40 years. My son had no interest in sports, absolutely none, which I decided was proof that God had a sense of humor. Max, once I figured this out, I tried to build a bridge to him with other parts of my interests. Comedy. Got him hooked onto the Marx Brothers early on. Got him hooked onto Looney Tunes early on. As he grew older and got a little more sophisticated, he loved the old radio comedy team of Bob and Ray. He developed a really dry sense of humor. And very funny kid. But again, he didn't show it to that many people. And he didn't communicate that well with his peers. Most of his friends were online that he would play video games with, that he would watch anime with. And that's where his interests lie. That and his camera. Max was a photographer. And he didn't like to take pictures of people. He didn't like to have his picture taken. And that's where the title of the book comes from. I keep trying to catch his eye. I'll show you, I'll talk as I'm pulling it up, but I was looking at my phone one day, gosh, about 3 years ago. That's the wallpaper on my phone. And that photo is of our 3 children. Our daughters are looking right at the camera and smiling. Max, as you can see, is looking up and away. And I was looking at that photo, and this is about 3 years ago, and I come on, Max, look at me, look at me. So I keep trying to catch his eye. Now, the actual cover of the book is a self-portrait of Max, which he is not of his back because he didn't like his picture taken. He was a photography major at RIT, and he had an assignment to take a photo for an author portrait of his book of photography. And that's the photo he took. He is looking out onto Lake Ontario, about a mile west of where he died. That area in Rochester is very familiar to us as a family. We went up there every summer for a family reunion. My wife's brother has a home on Lake Ontario, and that's why Max went to RIT. He was comfortable up there, and that's why when I got the phone call from the sheriff in Monroe County that they had found Max's car at the pier, that I knew what had happened. I knew right where it was, and I knew what those conditions were like up there in the middle of February, and there was only one logical conclusion. Max was well, and I should point out that I kind of feel like with this photo being published, not only is he a published photographer, but that we completed the class assignment. It really is now an author photo. So Max disappeared, as I said, in February of 2015. And because at the time I worked for ESPN, I distinctly remember the headline, "Son of ESPN writer is missing." And boy, you talk about clickbait, just those 4 letters alone are pretty magical. And the story was very quickly going viral. The 4 of us, Max and, Meg, my wife, and our 2 daughters and I, still wonder what Max would have thought about being the subject of national news. There was a story in People magazine's website. There were stories written in Rochester, in our part of Connecticut, stories that moved on the wire. And we had to decide very quickly, how public were we going to be about the circumstances surrounding Max's death. It was pretty clear early on that it was intentional. And as a journalist, the last thing I wanted to do was no comment somebody. That was part of the reason that we were fully open about the circumstances surrounding Max's death. Part of it was also selfish. You have to understand, you get news like that, it's all you can do to put one foot in front of the other. That first week when we were trying to figure out what happened and and the police were searching, and then the police scuba team is going out in 38-degree water looking for Max, which they did, God bless them, for 3 weeks. You know, it's all you can do to just, you know, as I said, put one foot in front of the other. I lost 8 pounds that week because eating was not really something I was interested in. So now we have to decide, are we going to be public or not? And if we're not going to be public, we have to decide, well, who are we going to tell, and how much are we going to tell who? You know, so then it becomes almost like a top secret classification deal. You know, and that was way too much work. It's not something I was interested in. I didn't really care who knew what. Whether it was suicide or whether he slipped and fell or whatever happened to him, it didn't matter. You know, once Max was dead, the rest to me was just details. So we decided we weren't going to hide anything. And I think the other part of that that's good is, let's face it, mental illness needs sunlight. You know, we don't talk about we've just begun to talk about mental illness as a society. And I'd say in the last, really even since Max's death, things have changed. You see a remarkable number of professional athletes who are deciding it's okay to say they're vulnerable. And it's okay to say they are struggling. Kevin Love in the NBA, Simone Biles in gymnastics, Calvin Ridley in the NFL. I mean, there's a list. And thank God that they are beginning to do that. You know, mental illness needs sunlight. You know, to me, the analogy is, in my parents' generation, probably leading up into the 60s, people didn't talk about cancer. And if they did talk about it, it was almost in a whisper. Sometimes you didn't tell whoever was sick that they had cancer. You know, we brought cancer out into the open, and look at the progress that's been made over the course of my lifetime, over the course of the last 10 years. Cancer is an illness. We're treating it as an illness. And it's incredible the amount of progress we've made. And that's what we need to do with mental illness, is treat it as an illness. And we're better about it. But to me, it's almost like climate change. You know, we admit there's a problem with climate change, but we're not acting fast enough to catch up to how many problems there are. And for whatever reason, we've got an epidemic of mental illness going on in our society and around the world. It could be social media, whatever it is. But, you know, that's it's a problem. And we need to be more open about it. I am familiar with some people that are doing really good work. I've just come off the board of a foundation in Hartford, Connecticut called the Jordan Porco Foundation. And they have created peer counseling programs for high school and college age children so that they can better spot when their friends are struggling. And there are colleges all over the country that are employing these programs, having the Porco Foundation come in and do seminars to teach kids what to look for in their friends. 3 years ago, I did one of the most meaningful pieces of I've ever written, and actually did it also in video for ESPN College Game Day, on the death of Tyler Helinski, who was a Washington State quarterback. Tyler ended his life in January of 2018. It was 3 years after Max died. And as soon as the news came over the wire, I thought, okay, here we go. Because I cover college football. I've covered it since 1987. And I knew that the editors and producers at ESPN were going to look to me for guidance on how to cover this and how to handle it. And at the outset, I didn't want to do anything. And what I didn't want to do was what we call in journalism a TikTok story. I didn't want to do the who, what, when, where, how of Tyler's death. Even to me, that felt intrusive. And so I just said, I'm not ready to do something. And pretty soon, a very good writer at Sports Illustrated named Greg Bishop wrote that piece, and they produced a short documentary and did a terrific job. Well, after those pieces ran, ESPN came to me again and said, we'd still like you to write. And so I said, look, we both know why you're asking me when we have all these reporters and producers and on-air talent. We all know why you're asking me. So if you're asking me what I want to write about, and if you're coming to me for expertise, what I know is the parents and what they're going through and how they have to learn, not how they have to learn to cope, but what's in front of them to learn to cope. So I reached out to Mark and Kim Helinski, and I explained who I was and what I wanted to do. And part of that was I felt comfortable doing that because fathers had reached out to me after Max died. People I didn't know, people in journalism, people in athletics, who were, and what they would say to me in various forms was, I'm 3 years farther down this road than you are. Let me tell you some things I learned. Let me explain, what helped me to think about this. So I had that. I had that as an example, and I really, journalism, you're not supposed to get involved emotionally with your stories, but this was different. And I felt like if I talked to the Helinskis, maybe I could begin to pay forward what had been given to me. And we did the piece, and I worked with a producer at ESPN named Lauren Soul, who just did a terrific job. And I wrote a piece for ESPN, and Lauren's piece ran on game day. And Mark and Kim became, to this day, good friends. And they have done, their response to their pain and their grief was to begin to create a foundation called Helinski's Hope. And the mission of Helinski's Hope is to help intercollegiate athletes better deal with mental illness and to help them achieve good mental health. And just in 3 years, they have created programs that they are using in athletic departments all over the country. And the results are spectacular. And to their credit, athletic administrators are understanding this is something we need to take seriously. I know, just as one example, the University of Nebraska has 5 psychologists on staff just for its student athletes. And that's important. And that kind of reaction, I hear from administrators regularly, what can we do? Thank you for doing what you're doing. We're paying attention to mental health. So that's the kind of reaction that you hope to see. And that's the kind of reaction that I wanted to help contribute to by writing I Keep Trying to Catch His Eye. I mean, of course, I wanted to tell something about Max. And of course, I'm a storyteller. I mean, that's how I'm going to react. Writers write. I didn't write the book to be cathartic. I didn't write it to be therapeutic. I think I had to do all that myself, get my legs under me before I could be in a shape to write and be in a shape to create a narrative. A lot of that is time. I'm talking, I know I sound like I've got all the answers, but trust me, grief is individual. As I read at the beginning of this webinar, And I'm just telling you what worked for me. I think everybody's different in how they approach grief. And, this is my story. It's not, as I said, it's not my wife's story. It's not our girl's story. I'll tell you one thing that happened. Our oldest, Sarah, lives in California, and she took her a couple of days to get her life in order before she flew back to Rochester when Max disappeared. And Sarah's very astute emotionally, and she gets off the plane in Rochester and says, we walked about 10 steps in the airport. She said, I read that half the parents who lose a child get a divorce. Are you two getting a divorce? I was like, whoa, let's, hold on, sweetie. Let's just do one disaster at a time, okay? And Meg and I had a strong marriage before this, and I think this, our reaction to it probably has made our marriage stronger. But what I have come to learn, and as I read about parents and grief, is that, and this came from David Kessler, who is one of the foremost experts on grief in the country, is that it's not the death of the child itself that causes parents to split up. It's that they judge each other's grief. And, why are you crying so much? Why aren't you crying so much? Why don't you go to the cemetery? Why do you go to the cemetery every day? And Meg and I really decided we were going to not do that to one another. We trusted one another. We knew that both of us loved Max dearly. So there was never any issue. We're just different people. Meg needed a roadmap of how Max got to that point. I didn't see where it was going to do me any good. She needed to know. As far as our girls were concerned, all we said to them is, look, we can't tell you how to grieve. We can make suggestions, but what we can tell you is you have to grieve. If you don't control how you get this grief out of you, then it will control when it comes out. You can't hold it in. And if you do hold it in, eventually it's going to burst out of you. And that might not be convenient to where you are in your life. So we encourage them both to get counseling, to do whatever they needed to do to help them process their grief. And they both did. And they too did it in very different ways. So, that to me is one of the big lessons of grief. And that's really, to circle back to where I started, that's why I wrote the book, is to help people understand this is what grief is like, to not be scared of it, to try to get a better handle on it. And I hope, I think the message is clear, and I'd like to think it's making a dent. But Atticus, I'll turn it over to you and see where we are, and be happy to answer any questions anybody has.
Yeah, well, so to all of the attendees, you are welcome to post any questions you'd like. I can just kind of throw a few out now, and would love to just have a discussion with you for 10 minutes or so before the hour. And then if anybody has any questions, I'll answer those too, or I'll pose those too. Just kind of jumping off of your last comment about grief being this very personal thing that everybody has to wrestle with in their own way. What do you think is most universal about grief? Because I think that this book, at least the perception of it to me, is that it is casting a lens on what grief is and how to not be afraid of it. And yet it is such a personal thing,
Yeah. Well, sure. I mean, to me, as I said, grief is a form of love, and everybody looks at love differently, and I think everybody handles their grief differently. Some people, Atticus, will say to me, "Well, you're so brave to be out in the open like this," or "You're so courageous." And I guess I would have that same reaction if I didn't know what this was like. But courage implies there's a choice. And I didn't really have a choice. I was thrust into this. And this is what my life is like. And I didn't feel a need to hide what that is like. To me, who am I protecting by not talking about my grief, or am I protecting the sensibilities of those people around me? Well, uh, it's not that I want people to share in my misery, but as I said, if you live long enough, you're going to deal with grief, because death is universal. And if I can explain what it's like, maybe it'll be easier for you to handle.
And going off of that, grief is a long process. It feels like, kind of what I love what you said in the reading early on, which is like the deeper you love someone and the deeper you've kind of committed that kind of energy to someone, the deeper that grief sits and the more of a void it is that you have to kind of sit with and fill. How do you get through? This is maybe, again, kind of maybe a more personal thing than the kind of objective view that you've kind of taken in this journalistic approach to looking at your own life. But how do you sit in those really hard days? How do you sit in those really hard moments where the emotions do take over, and the emotions and the wave of true deep grief do sweep over you?
Well, look, the early days, when you don't think that the pain is ever going to recede, or, it's grueling. It just is, but then you catch yourself having a good few minutes, and then you might catch yourself having a good hour. And you begin to learn that there is a not temporary quality to this, but there is still going to be joy out there if you are open to it. And that's the nature of life. Good things happen and bad things happen. And I didn't know, as comfortable as remaining in that fetal position would have been, that you scrunch up into in those early moments. If you stay in that, then you miss out on the other things that are going to happen, and then you've lost again, and for what? Because you were in pain. So sometimes those joyful things will help deal with the pain, and I just kind of figured out early on that as much as I wanted to stay back where Max was, that's not how the world works. And that if I tried to stay back there, then I was going to lose again. And so, to your point of, you used the phrase fill up that void. I don't think you can fill up that void, at least not fully. The picture I used to have in my head, especially in those early days, was, my life was, an earthquake had hit it, and my life was in shards on the floor, and I had to pick it up and try to re-glue it back together. And when you do that, it's never going to look as good as it did before it fell, but you do the best you can, and that's what you got, and you keep going.
So one follow-up to that, just kind of pulling in your history as a sports writer and this idea of like, the game's going to happen on Saturday. We live in this world that's kind of going fast all the time. there is no slowdown really. Um, and I hear what you're saying about this kind of the moments of joy will get you through, and you're not filling up the void. You're just kind of you're just going. You're continuing on with this glued bowl. But what's the balance? What's the balance between being able to sit in that nothing and really grieve, and knowing that still the next day, game day is coming. Like there's still the next thing to do. There's still the next meeting. There's still the next, I don't even know. Just everything is coming all the time. There's always new stimuli. Um, how do you give something that you need to grieve over its proper space, as well as continuing on?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's something that you just know in your gut. I had the luxury of, well, for one thing, Max died in the middle of the off season, so I didn't have a whole lot to do, from February to June. But I didn't really, I didn't have to work that much from February to June, or if at all. And I had that luxury to sort of really begin to focus on trying to put one foot in front of the other. And uh, the notion of balance, it's not, there's not going to be a balance. You are imbalanced. The one thing that bothered me early on is the notion that we were no longer the five of us. We're now the four of us. And that sounds to me, it still almost 7 years later sounds odd to me. But that's what our life is now. And it kind of feels like a comb over, like I'm trying to hide something that's missing, but that's what it is. So the notion of balance implies that you can sort of you can get back to where you were. And I think you just have to recalibrate what you have and get back on the road as best you can. And that's really the only choice you have. If that makes, I'm not sure I answered your question. I think I did.
No, it does.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that totally answers my question. I think the thing that's, um, I mean, just something that I'm thinking about in relation to this conversation is like my grandfather died a couple of weeks ago, and I've been here, like I've been in school, and not only does it feel very removed, and do I feel very removed, but he was like the one person in my family that I like had this deep soul connection to. So obviously it's not the same thing, but it is like I've been trying to figure out how to grieve, and I don't know how. Um, and I have so much going on here that it feels like there's all this very present things right in front of me.
Right.
And yet something on the other side, like the literal other side of the country, um, it has that kind of void, and it's there. Um, and I didn't feel like I gave it its proper space in the moment, and I still don't really feel that way. I've come to like it's again, like death happens. It's just part of it. It's like one of the few things that will happen for sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's that. Just to bring in a little bit of kind of my personal side, that's one of the reasons why I asked that question, is like I don't know where to and if to give the space now, and if that's even something I can or need to do from far away, and
Yeah. Sure.
yeah.
Well, no, and that's part of the individuality of grief is that we all, every situation is different. And, I think, there is it's somewhere in, it may be that somewhere in your head, that that's the natural order of things, is that, your grandfather is going to die before you, and you're busy, and so while I don't know whether it was expected or unexpected, but he's older than you are. I think you just have to honor those feelings, and when you have the time and the place to do it. You know, I can't. Each situation is different. You know, my wife and I talk about how, you know, our girls look at us and go, "Oh my God, they lost a child," and we look at them and say, "Oh my God, they lost a sibling," you know, because our siblings are still alive. So I think there's a difference between ignoring it and just finding the right time and place for it. And you know, clearly you're not ignoring it and not shoving it, you know, into a corner of your brain somewhere. And you know, it may be when you're with your family, it may be when your life slows down, but you know, the grief will be there when you access it.
So yeah, thank you. Yeah. Well, I acknowledge that we're right before the hour, so I think we should probably wrap it up. If there's anything else you'd like to say to the couple of viewers here, go for it.
Thank you for being here, and I hope that you get something from the book. I hope you got something from this. If you know, any questions, you can go to ivanmaisel.com and email me, and I'll get back to you. And I appreciate the time.
Yeah. Well, I also have a little bit to say right at the end here. So thank you, everyone, for being here. It's been an honor. Ivan, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight with At Home with Literati. Thanks to our viewers, and make sure to buy I Keep Trying to Catch His Eye. The link is in the chat. So take care. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.